Welcome to the Beyond Ordinary Women podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Matthews, and today I have with me Dr. Nijay Gupta. He is a professor at Northern Seminary and a prolific author. Welcome, Nijay.
Hi, Kelly. Looking forward to our conversation.
This is going to be fun, I think. Fun, that's relative, I guess, but it'll be intriguing, I think. Nijay has written a lot of books. He's been a professor for a while. A lot of his books have to do with Paul and the New Testament letters that he wrote, but he's also written one particular book that is specific to our topic today, and it is called Tell Her Story. It came out a couple years ago, and it basically tells about the women in the New Testament who were really involved in leading and participating in the mission of the church. So it has become quite popular from what I understand. I certainly enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's funny. I just had an idea to write this book, and I sent it to a editor friend of mine, Anna Gissing, and she was so excited, and then it just sort of took off from there. So big thank you to University Press for publishing it.
Oh, they're great. So, one of the women in that book we're going to start with. Our topic today is specific, not that broad of women involved in the church, but specifically ones who were imprisoned for their faith. And one of the women you cover in the book does hold that honor, I suppose.
Mm.
And we're also going to talk about one who is post biblical days, who still in the early church, and maybe we'll hit a third one. So, Nijay, tell us who Junia is and why we need to know about her.
Yeah, a lot of my work on this subject owes a debt to Romans 16, which is the last chapter of Paul's big letter to the Romans. And I used to think of Romans 16 as a bunch of kind of hellos that Paul gives at the end of the letter, almost like end credits in a movie. And you sort of get up, you don't pay attention, you leave the movie theater. And so I had a friend in seminary who actually memorized the whole book of Romans. And he asked me, "Oh, should I memorize Romans 16?" And I said, "You're at the end, just finish it off." But there's that sense if you're preaching through Romans, you kind of have so much to work with just in the first four chapters, let alone if you
Right.
get to chapter 11, let alone if you get to chapter 15, that I don't know if I hear very many sermons on Romans 16. But what's amazing is in Romans 16, you have dozens of names mentioned. People where they say, greet so and so, greet so and so. And actually, it's hard to tell who might be a man's name and who might be a woman's name, like Persis, Tryphena, Tryphosa, some of this stuff, they're just names that are unfamiliar to us. But right there in Romans 16, verse 7, you have these two people, Andronicus and Junia. Now, we probably won't get into the entire controversy, but there's been a long-standing discussion about Andronicus we know is a man, and Junia sometimes appears with an S at the end of her name. Now, if you open up your Bible and you look at Romans 16:7 and Junia has an S at the end, that means that the translators intend for us to think this is a man's name. And if it has an A at the end, then it's intended to be a woman's name. Well, skipping over the whole controversy,
Yeah.
the vast majority of scholars agree that this is a woman. And it's interesting when you read all the details. At first glance, it doesn't appear to be all that important, but when you really take stock and understand exactly who this person is, Andronicus and Junia are actually very, very important. We learn a few things about them. One, it says that they're Jewish,
Mhm.
which is interesting because Paul has kind of a tendency to have a special appreciation for his fellow Jews who are believers in Christ and leaders. Secondly, it says that they're in Christ before Paul, which means they became believers before Paul. He became a believer pretty dang early.
Right. Yeah,
So
they've been
that
around a
says,
while.
yeah, it says something special about them. I get the sense that they could have been either part of Jesus' earthly ministry, which is amazing, before he died, or perhaps they were commissioned during his resurrection appearances. we learn about that in 1 Corinthians 15, book of Acts chapter 2, 1 and 2. And then two more things it says. One very well discussed and known, and the other not so much. One is it says they're prominent, noteworthy among the apostles. Now that could be taken in two different ways. It could be they're taken as noteworthy to the apostles, but they're not apostles. Or it could be taken that they're noteworthy among or as apostles. Now, there's been cases for this and that. I won't go in the whole controversy, but what I will say is I think that taken as noteworthy as apostles is the more natural reading of the text for me. And it's what was assumed by Greek-speaking theologians of the church after the New Testament until the medieval period. I think 99.9% of them just took for granted that these two were apostles. Now, we have to change what we think about apostles in terms of categories. There were the big A apostles, which were the 12 minus 1 plus Paul.
Right.
And then you have other folks that counted as apostles like Barnabas and Mark and others. So we think maybe there were even hundreds of apostles because they're people that Jesus commissioned for ministry. And we learn that he appeared to hundreds of people. He could have commissioned them for ministry. So I think of an apostolic community. Okay, last
Okay.
detail, and this one gets ignored. It says they're fellow prisoners with Paul. And very few sermons talk about this. Very few commentaries talk about this. But as I was researching for my book, this is a huge deal because Paul kind of takes pride in being in prison for the Lord. And it's a kind of place you don't want to be. And it's a kind of thing
No.
where one thing I say about Junia, because thinking about women in the early church, whenever I talk to churches, just to kind of get their imagination going, she had to be in prison long enough for Paul to commend her, so it's not like overnight, but short enough for her to live. Think about that.
True. Okay, so a couple years ago, I got to visit Italy, and we went to what's it called, the Maritime? Is that it?
Mamertine, yeah,
Mamertine in Rome, and it's the prison where traditionally Paul was housed.
sure. Yeah,
And so, they let you go down into it. It's a carved out hole in a rock
yeah,
with a
yeah,
tiny hole at the top where they would let people in. And so you think of men living there. I mean, I want to say maybe 30 people could be crammed into that space, like without personal
yeah, yeah.
space. It's horrible. Like we wandered in and you look around, it's it's unimaginable by today's standards. And then you think of women being in there when and just the further dangers that they would have encountered. So yeah, this was no easy stint, in the local clink.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the problems with Bible translation and reading the Bible is we bring to the Bible certain assumptions, modern assumptions, because we just assume it was like the same now as it was back then. So when you hear jail or prison, you know, you kind of think of what jail or prison is like in America today, and it's really not like that at all in the Roman world. So let me make a few clarifications based on what I had learned about Roman prisons. So when I was in elementary school, we went on a field trip to the local jail in my small hometown. And
Okay.
I don't remember much about it, but I remember two things. I think this wasn't what I was supposed to have learned from this. Number one, they had lollipops. I remember that. And number
Okay.
two, they had cable TV.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So today we differentiate between jail, which is kind of short term, more minor crimes, and then prison, which is a bigger deal. In the Roman world, they didn't really have jail. They really just had prison. And when I think of prison today, I think of like the Shawshank Redemption, or I
Mm,
think of Alcatraz, where we went to Alcatraz not too long ago, my family, and you have these individual prison cells. And as you kind of hinted and noted, that wasn't what Roman prisons were like. There were a few like prisons that were built as prisons in the Roman world, like the one that you mentioned. But in many cities, there weren't official prisons. They would just recommission another building to be a prison, and they really didn't have individual cells. You wouldn't be in a cell by yourself unless you were like a special person of interest that they wanted to make sure didn't die. So really you would be, and what we get from some of the ancient sources is, you kind of mentioned this, is you'd have a room that fits 10, but they'd have 30 in there
Mm,
or 40. So we actually don't have a ton of information about it, except maybe some like fiction things that kind of ramp up the drama. But what we learn about it is poor ventilation. So people
mm,
died of suffocation, disease, no lighting. You mentioned underground. So they don't have artificial lighting, obviously, unless they have like a torch or something, which they don't want to give fire to the people. People are chained. We know that from the New Testament. But here's what's really interesting: men and women would not have been separated.
mhm.
And I always thought, oh, they have a women's prison, they have a men's prison, because we do that in the modern world. But they didn't. Actually,
Yeah.
exceptionally few women were in prison, statistically. Very, 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 very few. If you were a woman and you committed a crime worthy of prison, well, let's put it this way: if you committed a petty crime, you would probably be beaten or you'd be sent home to be punished by your family if you're a woman. If you're a man, beaten, fined, whatever. Really, prison was for major crimes because you have to use Roman resources on these people. And prison wasn't an end in itself. Nobody was given life in prison. You could be life exiled. Ovid was exiled, John of Patmos. But nobody is put in prison for life. Now, you may end up being in prison for a long time waiting for a trial because you're kind of low on the pecking order.
Mhm,
And then when you're in prison, there could be random beatings, flogging, whatever. But you could also be assaulted by other prisoners as well. And
mhm.
so when we think of a woman in prison, in many ways, it's actually riskier than a man because she's worried
Mhm.
about being assaulted.
Yeah.
And there just aren't a lot of women in prison. So she doesn't have any strength in numbers. There's no reason to protect women. You're fearful of the guards, you're fearful of other inmates. This is one of the reasons I think that Junia probably would have been one of Paul's heroes, because
Mm.
he's thinking she went to prison, she got out, and then she went back into ministry. And if I went to prison as a woman in the ancient world for Christianity, I'd be like, I'm done. Afterwards, I'm like, I'm done. I'm going to retire, give me a mansion, whatever. She went right back into ministry.
What do you think were egregious enough activities that would put a woman in prison?
Yeah, as I said, these are major crimes. These are crimes against the state. These are crimes that earn you a trial with a magistrate, right? And
Mhm.
so when we think about big crimes, we can rule the really sinful ones out. So not murder, not
Right,
like,
she's there as a Christian, yeah.
yeah, not like grand theft horse, like we're not talking like, we're talking about things that Paul would consider noble, right? So then I think we have a few options, and these are kind of this is kind of guesswork, but that's, we have
Mhm,
such little information, we have to guess. One is teaching a dangerous philosophy. I don't think that's very likely, because even when Paul did this with the Mars Hill Council, he didn't get thrown in prison. It would just be like a weird cult. Kind of like in
mhm,
America, you kind of monitor weird cult, not dangerous, just monitor, but weird cult
mhm.
dangerous, let's send the
Yeah.
FBI in. So I think it'd be like that, where I doubt it would be a dangerous philosophical teaching. But take, for example, Socrates, he's teaching against the gods and he ends up being executed. A second option, which I think is probably more likely because this is what Paul got in trouble for, is inciting a riot or civic strife. So they're not so much worried about what this person is teaching or doing, but the effect of what they're doing.
Yeah, okay.
So I
So
think about what's
she may have been involved in kinda like Paul, like teaching something that then resulted in a mob or something to that effect.
exactly. So so I ended up writing this fictional set of letters between Junia in prison and the church in Rome. Like as if like Paul writes letters from prison. So I thought,
Mhm.
what if Junia did? So I wrote these letters and I read them in class sometimes. And the inspiration for kind of how I constructed the narrative was Paul's experience in Ephesus, where, he's teaching this stuff and then people are upset because they've lost some income because magical books are being burned and all kinds of stuff. And so they kind of come after him. And then, someone says, "Hey, let's chill this out before the, Roman soldiers arrive and, lock everybody up or worse." I imagine something like that. So what's really interesting about that, Kelly, is Junia can't do that sitting behind a desk at a church. She can't do that sitting at home. She's got to be a public facing figure to be rounded up. Because if it's like, oh, Andronicus was doing these things and then Junia is just sort of lumped in together, we don't really see that happening in the ancient world. If it's just sort of the tag along wife, she's left out in the dust. There's no reason to lock her up. It would really be, and we're guessing, but it'd really be she's got to be equally implicated in whatever.
Mhm. Okay. So active, public, that sort of behavior, obviously courageous enough
Yeah.
to be willing to risk this sort of thing. And so that's all we really know about Junia because she is a brief mention amongst other people whom Paul appreciated in Rome. So we'll transition from her to a second end of the second century. We're going to go,
Hmm.
I believe they were in Carthage, Perpetua and
Yes.
Felicity.
Right.
Perpetua is a wealthy young woman, married, we think married with a child,
With a child,
who's
yeah.
maybe one or two, still
Yeah.
nursing, that
Small.
kind of
Yeah.
thing. And her slave woman, Felicity, who is with child. So we've got these two very, I mean, their womanhood is accentuated in this story. And yet they are in prison because they are Christians. So can you tell us any more? Give us a little bit
Yeah.
of their story.
This is really interesting because when I went in search of stories about women in prison in the ancient Roman world, other than Junia and Perpetua, there isn't a whole lot. And there's very little with named women. That's because ancient literature just doesn't focus on women. And
Mhm.
especially when you get into the Roman Empire, yeah, there just aren't these kinds of stories. So even modern Roman historians, classic scholars have to rely actually on the diary of Perpetua for most of what we
Okay,
learn about women's
yeah,
experiences in prison. She's the
that's a
most
big deal that
extensive account
yeah,
and
we
certainly the most extensive firsthand account.
okay. I love the fact that we have a woman's writing that still exists from 1800 years ago.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, anyway, I did mean to interrupt, but I wanted to accentuate that what we know of her comes from her own hand, and the appendix, maybe that you would say,
Sure.
that somebody added onto the end to give us the rest of the story.
We
Okay,
learn a
go ahead.
lot of we learn a lot of interesting things from her story. We learn that the Roman Empire obviously was non-discriminating when they throw people in prison in the sense that she is thrown in with men. And that was actually one of her concerns in the story is that she has a baby and she's worried about her baby, she's worried about herself, she's worried about her purity being compromised, and so she kind of requests to get put, in a safer place. Now, this tells us another thing, which means if you had money and connections, you can get things done. Maybe not get out, but you could maybe, create a little better environment for yourself. So she does. In terms of kind of her circumstances, we do have to differentiate first century Christianity and second and third century Christianity because in the first century, Christians really aren't on the radar of the Roman Empire. It's this upstart, cult meaning new religious group. And they weren't really calling themselves Christians until the end of the first century. They would be mistaken for kind of an offshoot, kind of a subcategory, let's say, of Jews, zealous Jews for this person named Jesus. When we get to Perpetua, we have to think in terms of like now Christianity is a thing that the Roman Empire is aware of and concerned about, because the Roman Empire was pretty tolerant towards new religions or foreign religions, as long as they kind of respected the Roman way. And I just want to pivot really quickly to the story of Polycarp. So Polycarp is a second century Christian leader who gets on the radar of Rome, and they arrest him. And it's really kind of a funny story. If you read the story of Polycarp, it's really enjoyable. He's super old. These police arrive at his house, and he's like offering them food. And then he's like, they're coming to take him, and he's like, I need to pray. And they wait for him to pray, and it's really entertaining. And then he gets taken to the Colosseum. And there's a really interesting moment where, the emperor says, you have to swear by my genius, which means by the spirit of, the emperor, and say to the other Christians, away with the atheists. And Polycarp turns to the pagan crowds, and he says, away with the atheists, to them instead. And then Caesar's like, burn him up, let's kill this guy. and it's this, there's this story that's often retold of these heroes kind of dying peacefully, even though they're being tortured, et cetera, et cetera. Similar story with Perpetua, where they weren't necessarily going out looking for Christians, but by this time they are concerned with a cult that is so anti-worshiping the Roman gods, the Roman emperor, and that sort of thing. But what's really fascinating, and I don't know that you know this. You wouldn't have any way of knowing this, Kelly, but I'm writing a follow-up book to tell our story. You may know that. And actually the first chapter is about Perpetua.
Oh, perfect. Here we go.
And what I say, so I'm leaking some of this, so don't
Dump
tell
it all.
anybody.
Go, let's hear it.
I'm leaking some of this. So the second book is going to be about women prophets in the Bible. And the hook for the idea is, in the Roman world, you definitely had a hierarchy of power, and women were lower on that hierarchy. However, there was a loophole, and the loophole was prophets and soothsayers and oracles. I mean, these people basically operated independently of power systems because they had a direct line to God or the realm of the divine. And so all that to say, it's focusing on prophecy. Now, I consider Perpetua a prophet, but I'm defining that pretty broadly because she could compel visions from God at will. So the hook for my book, the very beginning of it says, did you know 3 women were wildly famous in second century Christianity? Wildly famous, celebrity Christians. One was Perpetua, and 2 were actually heretics, but they were women part of something called the New Prophecy, which is the Montanist movement. There's 2 women, Maximilla and Priscilla, not the Priscilla from the New Testament. But these 3 women were wildly famous. They were celebrity Christians in the second century, and they were all prophets. 2 of them are condemned. One of them is praised, Perpetua. Anyway, something you probably didn't know.
Had not made that connection, no. How was Perpetua such a celebrity in the second century when she was...
Second and third century. Yeah, I fudged it a little bit because I wanted to just sort of, second and third century.
And I say that for the audience because she was killed in 203, which is technically the third century. She was
I'm reaching a little bit
right
there.
around that edge.
Yeah.
That's okay. So she's in prison. She's got her slave girl with her. They're both condemned to die in the arena, which was a favorite way for the empire to get rid of their dissidents, that kind of thing. Tell us a little more about Felicity's experience.
It would be odd to put a slave in prison. Slaves were expendable, and so you wouldn't waste government resources on a slave. no matter how educated they were, no matter how. So I think this must be a special circumstance. The special circumstance being they rounded up a group of catechumens, which means they were
Mhm.
in training. And so she must have been lumped together and somehow kind of was just taken as a package with these other
Right.
catechumens. I'm honestly not as familiar with Felicity as I am Perpetua because of the work I've been doing lately on Perpetua. But it would be odd. I mean, what these stories reveal and why they were passed down from generation to generation is what people were willing to do for the sake of their Christian faith.
Mhm.
And what tended to rise to the surface of popularity was the more extreme examples: imprisonment, martyrdom, speaking out to against authorities. But I think there is perhaps a flavor, just a taste of that sense of the early Christians defying the structure system of the Roman Empire, saying we're going to focus on a slave. We're going to
Mhm.
focus on a woman slave. We're going to focus on a pregnant woman slave. If there's someone that you don't send into
Mhm.
battle in the Roman
Exactly.
Empire, but
Yeah.
obviously today, you don't send a pregnant woman.
Even now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, into battle. And yet this is what the early Christians were saying is, you know, we
Mhm.
don't we don't do what other people do. We are willing to risk everything because of our passion for Christ. This actually reminds me of a story. This is getting a little bit nerdy and in the weeds here. But it reminds me of a story from the era of the Maccabees. So the Maccabees were these freedom
Mhm.
fighters that were fighting for the sake of Judaism in the second century BC, and they were fighting off a tyrant named Antiochus. And there's all these stories about heroes, and one hero is this mother of 7 sons.
Mhm.
And this tyrant is trying to do everything to get these people to recant their faith. And one of my favorite moments, I want to say this is in Fourth Maccabees, but I don't remember exactly, is they say to her, like, we're going to kill your children, and then we're going to kill you. And most of us would say, don't kill my children. And she says, as horrible as that would be, I stand by my faith. And then they're like, we're going to gut you. And she rips out her own intestines and throws it at them and say, take my intestines. Now, the fact that that's a woman in that story,
Mhm.
in the second
Mhm.
century BC, this is before Jesus, is fascinating because you just don't see stories like this. You have the Amazonian women,
Yeah.
you just don't see stories like this. And both in early Judaism and in early Christianity, you have stories of these incredibly daring, courageous, literally death defying in the sense that, they survive, they're experiencing, you know, pious transcendence while they're being martyred. You have these women in of the faith in our stories.
Yeah. In the second century, right before Perpetua and Felicity, about 25 years before them, Blandina is another slave woman who she was outside of Rome, more over in Gaul, modern day France. She again was sent to the arena. There's a whole story about her. And she pretty much laughed in their face, like,
Mhm.
fine, do your worst. And she was there with mostly men who,
Yeah.
again, rounded up with her. And her courage inspired the men to die honorably. She lasted till the end. Apparently, the story goes that she ended up being crucified. They just stuck her on a pole right there in the arena. And the image that reminded them of Christ so much, like that
Mm.
was an inspiration to the people in there. And so her story has lived on because one of the things that these women are showing that is anti-cultural or countercultural, as we would say, is that the virtues in Rome, as you well know, were gendered, and
Mhm. Absolutely.
courage was male, strength was male, honor was male, and there were ways for women to show that, but not it was not their dominant. They had piety and other sorts of virtues assigned to them. But what these women are showing us is that no, courage can be female too. Courage, strength, honor. They're just human virtues. They're not
Absolutely.
gendered. And that all of them, all of these women displayed these virtues because of their faith in Christ. Really brings honor to him and also inspires the rest of his followers.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I'm certain that these second, third century accounts go back to the Old Testament and women like Moses's mother,
Mm,
women, who courageously saves, Moses' life, Moses' sister, who follows,
yeah, she was
from the
smart.
movies.
Mhm. Yeah.
Miriam, who follows the little boat and, makes
Uh-huh.
sure he's okay. The courage of the Egyptian princess who takes in this child, the courage of the midwives
Mhm.
who are protecting, the courage of
Yeah.
Rahab, who hides these spies at the risk of her own family. You have this over and over and over again. Shout out to my colleague Ingrid Farrow
Yeah.
and Joy Dalrymple, who co-wrote a book coming out called Redeeming Eden, which show women at strategic points in the story the Bible tells of salvation. Fantastic book coming out this year. And then in the New
Good.
Testament, I think we do see this pattern of courage. I think of, for example, Mary, the mother of Jesus, showing up to the cross.
Mhm.
I've
Yeah.
talked to numerous historians about this. We don't see a lot of women
Mhm. There was a whole
standing in
group
front
of
of
them.
crucifixions in
Yeah.
normal Roman accounts. It's not a place where you would find, it's not a safe place. And to have Mary there and have these other women there when the men were actually hiding, it says, strike the shepherd, the sheep will scatter, is interesting. You have that courage. You have Mary Magdalene. You have, you have Yodi and Syntyche in Philippians 4, where Paul says they contend or fight side by side with me for the faith of the gospel. I mean, they got to be doing really risk-taking, really dangerous things for him to use that language. He's using
Mhm.
language of battle when he's doing that, and so he's saying these are warriors.
Good point. Yeah. I think the language that we have in our New Testament, Old as well, the words become common to us. And so we gloss over them and don't necessarily see the connection of what was the significance of the of using that word to describe these people. Coworker is another
Mhm.
word he uses for Yodi and Syntyche, and he uses that
Absolutely.
same word with Timothy and
Yeah.
Mark and
Yeah.
those sorts of
Apollos. Yeah.
guys. Yeah. So yeah, so women in the early church and biblical times and beyond were just as courageous, just as
Yeah.
active
Risk taking.
in spreading the gospel and defending Christ and just living for Him in really extraordinary and dangerous ways, specific to these women who were experienced prison and sometimes martyrdom. So yeah,
I remember coming across kind of by chance. I was reading St. John Chrysostom's homilies on, I think it was Colossians.
you're a
And
nerd.
I know, occupational hazard. And what's interesting is in modern Pauline scholarship, scholars, we won't get into it, but they don't think Paul wrote Colossians, Ephesians, and therefore those texts get kind of sidelined in academic conversations. That's not what I think, but that those ideas are out there.
Mhm.
And if you go back to Chrysostom, he didn't talk about authorship issues, but he says the prison letters are more precious than the non-prison letters because Paul Paul courageously wore the bonds of Roman imprisonment, and in those moments, his 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 thinking would be clarified about what's really important. So Chrysostom goes on this whole sidetrack of saying, "Blessed be the bonds. Blessed be the bonds that Paul wore," and he wishes he could kiss the bonds. He wished he could wear the bonds. There's this whole idea of like suffering for the name, right? We get this in
Yeah.
Philippians 1. it's been given to you as a gift not only to believe in him, but to suffer for his sake. You have in the book of Acts where they were praising God when they left prison, counting it an honor to suffer for the kingdom and so forth. And I think Paul would have had a special circle of honor for people that went to prison for the gospel. And he had a special respect for them. You know, I take a line from Hamilton, dying is easy, living is harder. It's one thing to die for your faith, it's another thing to face the shame and
Mm.
torture, literally.
And
Um,
uncertainty of will I ever get out?
Uncertainty,
Yeah.
degradation, anxiety, all of it, of imprisonment. I think it'd be worse for women than men. And so for someone like Junia, I mean, Andronicus faced the same things, and we should acknowledge that. But for Junia to do it means that she has to realize she belongs to Christ. Her life is not her own.
Mhm.
And she's called to, as Paul says, not to live for themselves, but for the one who died and rose for their behalf. That's what she was doing.
Like you said a minute ago, when you read the words, the suffering, in the scripture, I think that as, 21st century people, we think one thing of suffering, and often we just think any confrontation is suffering or any
Right.
pushback. It could be real weak or it could be some actual, I lost my job versus, or I lost a relationship, actual suffering. But the stories of the physical and the life threatening and the just your whole life could fall apart because you chose to stick with Jesus. You were aligned with him. Your faith was in him. You're team Jesus, not team Caesar. It made a huge difference in how your life went forward. And every person that we're talking about, basically, they are a witness to say, well, Jesus is better, even though it might not look like it right
Yeah.
now. Jesus is better. That's my new catchphrase. I love it. I stole it from a friend of ours. But yeah, I appreciate your insight, the historical perspective that you bring to us. I can't wait for your second book. This
Mhm.
next one that's coming up, not your second, just your next one. So yeah, maybe if you have a title, we will put that in the show notes, or you can tell us when to be looking for it. Okay.
It's tentatively titled. IVP does a great job with titles, but right now it's called God Spoke Through Her.
Mm.
And and hopefully late 2026 or early 2027. These things take
Okay,
time.
year and a half. Okay, that sounds good. Well, thanks for being here. This will be a great addition to our library. Beyond Ordinary Women has plenty of resources that are free to access for anyone who's teaching or leading women. And we even have some that relate to the early church and these sorts of themes. So thanks for being here, NJ. And we'll catch you again soon.
My pleasure. Great conversation. Appreciate it.
You bet.